This is no exaggeration. It took major news outlets only minutes to start pushing unfounded claims about what happened in the election, especially surrounding which groups of people voted which ways. The news is filled with these claims. You can't avoid them, like what happened with Black voters, Latino voters, and other groups. The media didn't just rush to say things that might turn out not to be true. They ignored previous warnings from inside their own news agencies. In the rush to get you to click, to listen, to watch, they have been saying all sorts of stuff as though it's somehow definitive and true. Meanwhile, these reports themselves conflict with each other. It is a mess. Today, I'm going to talk you through it so you can be equipped to siphon out what we know from what we don't know. To help you see what's going on, I'm going to start with something that might seem surprising, but you'll hear why it's the ultimate way to understand this. It's a claim about Hillary Clinton, something you've probably heard many times that was probably not true. Meanwhile, this media failure provides such an important counterpoint to another media failure that also occurred in recent days, and that was the media's inability to accurately cover a pogrom in Amsterdam. These two might sound totally unrelated, but there's one media rule at the core of both these failures. I'll explain. Plus, I've been asked about the role of truth in America and in general, and whether it has even less value now. Don't give up. I'll offer what might provide some hope, no matter where you stand politically. It's been a busy week as I've been working to get this ready for you, so here it is, ahead today on They Stand Corrected. Hello and welcome. So good to have you here. I'm Josh Levs, and this is They Stand Corrected, the podcast that fact-checks the news. I've been hearing from so many listeners over the past week saying that this is more needed than ever. I appreciate that you're telling me that. You are being inundated with this avalanche of alleged information, but a lot of it cannot be trusted. And reports that are presented as being definitive and factual conflict with each other. If you're new to this show, I want to thank you for joining us. It's so great to have you. Quick primer on me. I spent 20 years inside mainstream media, 10 on NPR and 10 on CNN. On CNN, I became the lead on-air fact checker, and I saw throughout those years these problems in mainstream media that prevent the news from doing its job, making sure that you always get truth, which requires two things, facts plus context. The hardest times to break through the noise with facts are when emotions are so high, and that is certainly the case now for people who voted different ways. I've heard from listeners who are horrified for the future of democracy in America and for the rights of women and others to have control over their own bodies. I get it. And I've heard from people who said they actually feel more hopeful now than they did before the election. Some people don't think the Democratic Party is doing enough about violent radicals on the left who contribute to another kind of anti-democratic threat. I get it. All of these concerns make sense. But no one can fix anything or make anything better without first understanding the reality. That is where the media should be helping, but it's not doing the job. So I'm going to talk you through this, and I'm going to tell you this at the top. One thing I learned early on in broadcasting is if you're ever using numbers, don't expect people to memorize them. So I'm going to tell you folks right now, I'll mention some numbers along the way, but it's fine for them to go in one ear and out the other. The times that I'm going to be using numbers, I will be using them to explain to you how different they are in different places and why they cannot be trusted. If you want to go back and get the numbers, they will be available in my newsletter. With each episode, I put out a newsletter packed with links and more, and I encourage you to sign up for it. It's free. You can find it at my website, joshlevs.com, JOSHLEVS.com. Just click on newsletter. And while that is free, one great way to support this show is to choose to become a paid subscriber there. I have exclusive content for paid subscribers, and I answer your questions. You can reach me directly, and it's paid subscribers to the newsletter who go a long way in helping me decide what I talk about on this show. You help set the agenda for They Stand Corrected, and I appreciate it. All right, here is an example of the kind of thing that you have been subjected to in recent days. This is a clip from CNN about how Trump did.
How about among black voters? It was the best performance for a Republican candidate for president in 48 years since Gerald Ford back in 1976.
Was it? Here's a quote from the Washington Post. Black women and men continued to overwhelmingly support the Democratic nominee in this presidential election. This year and in 2020, roughly 9 in 10 Black women backed Harris and Biden, respectively, although Democratic Party leaders expressed concern about Harris's pre-election poll numbers among Black men. This group continued to support Harris at similar levels when compared with previous presidential elections. In both 2024 and 2020, just under 8 in 10 Black men supported the Democratic presidential nominee. So we've got that previous thing from CNN, and then we've got Washington Post saying no significant change here. Which is it? The answer that the media won't tell you? We don't know. And that is because of the mad world of exit polls. This is where this reality check needs to start. Let's pull out of this election and think back. 2 presidential elections ago, in 2016, there was a claim that became so widespread that you probably heard it. It was everywhere. It became part of the lore. The claim was that more than half of white women voted for Trump in 2016. That claim led to all kinds of think pieces and calls for new political strategies and hand-wringing and all that. But it probably was not true. That claim was based on an exit poll, and these polls are notoriously problematic. Even though they can be organized and conducted by people who are so well-meaning and trying, there are so many problems with exit polls. The reason for this involves nitty-gritty stuff that you don't need to hear here. I'll post links in the newsletter in case you want to dig into that stuff. After 2016, there was an extensive survey by Pew Research that took a bunch of steps trying to avoid some of the problems with exit polls, like those exit polls can be affected by who chooses to answer them. So this Pew survey took these steps to try to reach more people and make sure that demographics were what's called weighted to match the demographics of people who actually voted, and they studied the voter rolls. The upshot was, when that Pew study came out, it showed different numbers. Among white women specifically, it showed Clinton 45% and Trump 47%. And when any poll is that close, you don't need an expert to tell you that that's virtually a tie. So if 1 percentage point of the people in that survey had said Clinton instead of Trump, it would have been seen as a tie. A lot of white women voted for Trump. There's no reason to believe it was a majority. Maybe he got slightly more votes than Clinton did in that group, but by the time this information came out, the idea that more than half of white women voted for Trump was already fixed in people's minds. The chances that you ever heard that corrected or updated, that's pretty slim. This is where we get to today. News media have talked about the problems with exit polls. They have reported on this stuff. After the 2020 election, here was a headline from the Washington Post. Quote, "Don't trust the exit polls. This explains why." All right, so that's a Washington Post headline from 4 years ago. And yet now, the Washington Post has this huge interactive spread showing you how all these demographics allegedly voted. And what are they basing it on? An exit poll from the same company. Maybe the company fixed problems and got a better sampling this time, but there's no reason to know that or believe that. And this big spread from the Washington Post showing all these numbers, it doesn't have any kind of big caveat at the top. It doesn't even mention what they've reported about exit polls in the past. If you scroll way down, you see this typical language in small print about surveys. It says, like other surveys, exit polls are subject to sampling error and other sources of error. But it's after they've given you tons of alleged data points. There's no caveat as you go into it. So that's one problem. Here's the second problem. You see all these different news agencies talking about their exit polls. You hear CNN exit poll, NBC exit poll. There's actually only 2. One is by Edison Research. Several news agencies together use that one, including ABC, NBC, CBS, CNN. They talk about it as being theirs, ABC exit poll, but it's the same one. The other one is by something called AP Votecast, which includes this group at the University of Chicago. And to make things even more confusing, the people behind that one say, well, don't call us an exit poll. But a lot of people do anyway. Each of these 2 says that they have systems in place to get you the clearest idea of what happened in the electorate. But there are differences, and it's quite possible that both are wrong. To show you what a mess this is, let's play that little clip from CNN again.
How about among Black voters? It was the best performance for a Republican candidate for president in 48 years since Gerald Ford back in 1976.
I went and looked at CNN's latest report as I was preparing this. Here's what it says. Trump's improvement was fueled in part by Black men. CNN's exit polls showed just a 2-point shift among Black men toward Trump nationally. I probably don't need to tell you this, but a 2-point shift in a poll like this, is not even a definitive shift. Meanwhile, as I mentioned, the Washington Post has this report saying it basically stayed the same. And here's what the AP says. 16% of black voters supported Trump in 2024, up from 8% in 2020. If your mind feels like a fruit salad of numbers right now, I get it. Super simple, here's the deal. According to how news agencies are reading these two different polls, both of which could be completely wrong, maybe black support for the Democratic candidate stayed exactly the same. Or maybe it edged just barely toward Trump. Or maybe it doubled from 8% to 16%. They have no idea. That is the takeaway here. You know what? I'm just realizing that this might sound funny to you because I'm so obviously swimming against the current here. Like, here I am, someone who cares about facts, with this flood of claims and trying to make sense of them for you. Hopefully my exasperation is amusing. I mean, picture me preparing this episode and looking at all these headlines and wanting to scream at my computer. Here's another example. I'm going to get to Latino voters, but first, something I talked about last week is Jewish voters. There are all these narratives around that. It's never a major factor in elections. Jewish people are just over 2% of America. We do tend to be civically active and to vote in higher numbers. We might punch slightly above our weight in total votes, so maybe 3% of total votes, but nothing that's big enough to swing anything. But here's why I'm telling you this. Last week, I mentioned that there are these two wildly different figures. So one of these polls says 79% of Jewish people voted for Kamala. Another says 2/3 of Jewish voters went for Kamala. Those are very different figures. But guess what? Both of those polls say that it's the same as last time, right? So despite that difference, they're both saying there was no change. Now, that, of course, goes against anecdotal evidence. There are Jewish voters and people who are not Jewish who have told me about their Jewish friends who were saying that they were voting Republican for the first time. And one major reason is that they saw the Republican Party take the lead in exposing and standing up to anti-Semitism on college campuses. And there are people who have children dealing with this. There are voters who feel that the Democratic Party is doing too much to coddle groups that support Hamas and other Islamist terrorist groups. But there might not be enough voters who switched to show any kind of statistical swing. We don't know. And that right there is a set of 3 words that the media should learn to say. They don't want to tell you, we don't know, or we don't know yet. So instead, they toss tons of untrustworthy numbers at you to get your attention. Speaking of that, the media has not made clear to you some big things we won't learn for a while. For example, you've probably heard that millions fewer people voted this time. As I record this, there's actually no reason to believe that. Not yet. That throws off everything you have heard about the popular vote and its significance. That is after this. The major news agencies getting you all this inaccurate stuff, this messy information, they have huge budgets and big staff. I have just me. Your support is what allows this show to exist. There are 2 ways to support. You can become a paid subscriber at the newsletter, or you can make any kind of contribution. If you do that, we have merch for you. You'll find the links for that in the show notes. And there are other ways that you can help, like giving this show a great rating and review on the various platforms. That makes such a big difference. Here is one of the latest ones on Apple Podcasts. This is from T.G. Downing, who calls this show a breath of fresh air. Grateful for the work Josh Lives is doing. We need more voices like his in the media. Wow, thank you. And we get great messages like this.
Yo, Josh, what's up, man? This is G in Miami. Well, it's currently 3 a.m. here, which is also feeding time for my 5-month-old son. And it's also the perfect time for an episode of your podcast, They Stand Corrected. And I really appreciate your show because it decodes all the confusing stuff we hear in the mainstream news media today. And of course, you being an advocate for modern fatherhood makes it even more relatable for me. So keep up the great work, and thanks for everything that you do, brother. Take care.
Thank you so much. To submit your message for this show, you can get in touch through the links in the show notes or at my website, joshlevs.com, JOSHLEVS.com. One thing we can say definitively is that Trump picked up support among Latino voters, but just how much is not as clear as the media is making it sound. Here's MSNBC.
Across the country, Donald Trump made huge inroads with Latino voters. According to NBC exit polls, 55% of Latino men nationwide voted for Trump, a 19-point jump from 2020. Among Latina women like Mireya, an 8-point gain.
When you have multiple surveys with big enough margins that it's not super close, you can make a general statement. According to both of these surveys that I was just telling you about, Kamala won among Latinos. One says she got 52%, another one says she got 56%. In both cases, it does show Trump moving forward in that group. It seems like only Latinos who supported Trump are the ones getting all the news attention. Maybe the slight majority is just not as interesting to the media. And here's a potential wrinkle. Did fewer Latino people show up to vote this time? Could it be an enthusiasm gap, that people who wanted Trump were more inspired to go to the polls and people who didn't chose not to vote? Here is a headline from Newsweek. Quote, exit poll shows white vote surging as Black and Hispanic voters stay home. So maybe that will turn out to have been a factor. You can see what I'm saying. All the hand-wringing is a matter of frantic responses to claims, not measured responses to trustworthy data in which we actually know what really happened here. And that brings us to the overall picture. I've heard from lots of people saying, well, look, the number of votes for Trump is millions lower than it was last time, but Kamala's votes have dropped by millions more compared to what Biden got. This is where the news is creating a huge vacuum. News agencies should be reminding people or telling them how this works. It might turn out that there are just as many votes this time, and Kamala's popular vote numbers are going to keep increasing by millions. Why is that? Welcome to California.
If we're on pace with the last couple presidential elections, we've got 10 million more votes to go.
That's Rob Korinke, a political strategist being interviewed by KTVU.
And larger counties, namely Los Angeles and others, they will drop additional counts every few days, and it could go all the way to Thanksgiving. December 5 is the deadline. California is huge. Tons of people vote by mail, and those ballots can be postmarked up to and including Election Day. So as I record this, hardworking folks are still tabulating ballots. California goes for Democrats in national elections, so Kamala is likely to see her votes keep going up. This is more significant than it sounds. Yes, the presidential race is decided, and Trump won. But questions about the popular vote will determine whether it really is some big victory across the nation. It's looking like the answer to that is no. This is a place in which we have solid numbers as they come in, because we're not talking about polls anymore. We're talking about actual votes, concrete numbers. To its credit, the Washington Post did have a piece getting this right from reporter Aaron Blake.
It's likely he'll win a smaller percentage of the popular vote than any non-Trump president-elect since 2000, when George W. Bush won despite losing the popular vote. A big question is whether he could wind up shy of a popular majority. Regardless, it's overstating it to claim an unprecedented and powerful mandate when half of the population didn't vote for you.
This article also points out that Republicans running for Congress did worse than Trump did.
The reason Republicans flipped the Senate majority owes largely to the fact that the map was so favorable to them, rather than that voters swung so hard toward the GOP. Their pickups so far are in a trio of red states: Montana, Ohio, and West Virginia. And among the swing states Trump won, they'll probably go 1 for 5 by flipping only Pennsylvania.
In the big picture, here's something I can tell you. There's nothing at all unusual about the party that's not currently in power winning. The numbers do make clear that people wanted change, and that those who wanted change went for Trump by a larger margin. And all over the world, incumbents and their parties are losing. What makes things different here is the Republican primary that gave us Trump, of all people, as a candidate. Someone with such a disturbing track record of lying and committing crimes and standing against democracy. I know some people felt that he and his party are the better option of the two. It's not like everyone who voted for him worships him. Not at all. The numbers show that also, by the way. Here is political analyst Ron Brownstein on CNN.
55% said Trump was too extreme. 55% said he would steer the U.S. Toward a more authoritarian system. Obviously, a majority of voters continue to support legal abortion. A majority of voters oppose mass deportation. A majority of voters wanted the government to do more to expand access to health care. But in each case, a decisive slice of voters with those opinions were willing to take the risk of voting for Trump.
That is the kind of thing we actually can say, because what Ron was talking about there, that's what the people polled said. Of the people who were polled in that survey, majorities said they agree with those bad things about Trump, and a bunch of them voted for him anyway. That's a data point that does make sense. Remember what I said earlier about all those numbers? Just let them out of your head. You don't need to hold on to them. If you want to grab them from my newsletter, you can. The point here is that no one has been siphoning out what we actually know and don't know. Well, I'm trying to for you, so there's that. All right, how all of this relates to the media's failure to call out a pogrom in Amsterdam right after this. I'm so grateful to sponsors who are helping make this show possible, including MIT45. This company is on a mission to bring peace, vitality, and relief to the world by empowering individuals to be more of their unique, incredible selves. They do this by creating innovative, exceptional products, sourcing high-quality materials, and keeping standards high, including for safety. Their products include Kratom. The folks at MIT45 want you to learn all about it and make informed decisions. Check out the link in the newsletter and the show notes. 2 nights after the election in the United States, there was a pogrom on the streets of Amsterdam. Here's a little clip from a Jerusalem Post report.
An alleged Jew hunt was announced well in advance in the messaging app Telegram, prompting rioters to travel from far outside Amsterdam to attack Israelis.
The words Jew hunt are in quotes there. There are these screenshots from Telegram discussions in which apparently the plotters of this attack described it as a Jewish hunt or Jew hunt. It happened just a couple days before the city was set to commemorate Kristallnacht, a deadly Nazi pogrom against Jews in Europe. It came after a soccer game in which an Israeli team, Maccabi Tel Aviv, was playing. The Times of London says fans were knocked unconscious, thrown into canals, stamped on, and lacerated with punches. One fan was viciously rammed by a car, and others pleaded with the mob not to be killed. Rioters searched hotels for hiding Jews. The ADL says thousands of Israelis were hunted down, brutally assaulted, and injured. Details are still coming in as I record this. A lot of this information was already out by the time major news agencies started reporting on it. And even with this information, they initially avoided saying anything about it being an anti-Semitic attack. I learned about this first from Richie Torres, an awesome lawmaker from New York who does not happen to be Jewish, but is a true ally against anti-Semitism. He calls out media failures all the time. The initial New York Times headline said this, quote, "Violence tied to soccer game prompts dozens of arrests in Amsterdam." Here's what Richie wrote. The hollowness of the headline tells its own story about a deeper desensitization of the modern world to Jew hatred, even when the hatred metastasizes into violence. The Times was not alone. Even when news agencies started to get the word anti-Semitic into their coverage, it was almost always in quotes because it had to be attributed. Here is how this fits together with what I was just telling you about election coverage. The excuse that news agencies use is, well, we have to be careful. We don't know right away. We can't be sure. Yes, news agencies are oh so careful. Think about everything I was just telling you about with the election. They're making all these pronouncements about how different demographics voted, even though they know or should know that they cannot trust those early data points. They're not careful. They just want clicks. Even if you look just at anti-Semitism, they're not careful when it comes to right-wing anti-Semitism. When these news agencies report on right-wing anti-Semitism, no editors, no one makes them pause and say, well, wait, let's be careful. We don't know. Here's an example that was sent to me. There were these pro-Trump anti-Semitic ads in Michigan before the election trying to woo Arab Muslim voters. The New York Times, in its headline, called these ads anti-Semitic. Straight up, no quotes. But if it seems to be an Islamist group attacking Jews, well, then suddenly you have to hold back. The Times actually did update its headline more than once, and it ended up actually saying this.
Anti-Semitic attacks prompt emergency flights for Israeli soccer fans.
Still, the lead of the story went right into attribution.
The authorities in Amsterdam on Friday were investigating what they called anti-Semitic attacks on Israeli soccer fans. that took place amid a charged atmosphere surrounding a soccer match involving a visiting Israeli team.
I've also heard from listeners who point out that all this coverage is putting emphasis on how some Israeli soccer fans had allegedly behaved badly. It seems that was part of the strategy. The screenshots from Telegram include something about hanging a Palestinian flag so they will come like rats. And no, they did not en masse go after any flag. Maybe some drunk fans did or whatever. I looked into what people have contacted me about, and it's true. Major news agencies are playing up some bad behavior by apparently some Israeli soccer fans, which is pretty par for the course for any soccer fans. But it's being emphasized as though somehow the people who got attacked had it coming. One listener wrote me that this is what would have been called victim blaming before it became clear that none of this stuff applies when the victims are Jews. Another listener, a former professional journalist, told me she kept hearing stuff like this in the coverage on NPR, my other old stomping grounds. She said NPR was being even worse than The Onion and Al Jazeera. And speaking of Qatar's state-owned propaganda outlet, here's another piece of what happened in the media with this coverage. President Biden put out a good statement condemning these attacks. He wrote, "The anti-Semitic attacks on Israeli soccer fans in Amsterdam are despicable and echo dark moments in history when Jews were persecuted." Then a pundit jumped in. He used to be on Al Jazeera. Then he had his own show on MSNBC. His name is Mehdi Hassan. He responded to Biden. He said, "These soccer fans, or more accurately, hooligans, were," and then he said attacking people, and he listed other things that they were allegedly doing. Let's make this clear. The people behind this pogrom in Amsterdam went after people for being Jewish. People of different ages, people who had not engaged in any kind of bad behaviors. Not that that justifies it. Mehdi Hassan here is taking Biden's reference to Israeli soccer fans and saying they were doing these things. That is factually false. He is equating all of the victims, all of these people facing attacks, with the alleged bad behaviors of a few. When people do that to Arabs or Muslim people, Mehdi flips out and says, "Stop associating everyone in a group with bad behaviors." He literally, factually did that here. He's a frequent guest across the media, including at CNN. Will he face any negative consequences for this? It would be shocking if he did. I again learned about this from Richie Torres, who wrote, "Mehdi Hassan is justifying a pogrom against Jews in Amsterdam. Yet make no mistake, mainstream media will continue platforming Hassan because America no longer treats anti-Semitism as a moral line that should never be crossed. A society that fails to stigmatize anti-Semites will get more of them." Richie's right. There is no limit to how much anti-Semitism and justifying terrorism you can engage in and still stay in the mainstream media's good graces as long as you represent yourself as being on the political left. Richie is a Democrat, by the way. He campaigned for Kamala. In the Democratic Party, you are allowed to openly disagree and call things out. Part of what is so concerning about the current state of the Republican Party is the way that people show fealty to one leader and do not speak out publicly in Washington about problems like right-wing anti-Semitism inside the party. Between this disastrous coverage of the pogrom and what I was telling you about earlier, the mess with exit polls, is it all enough to make you depressed? Don't be. And don't give up on the fight for truth. Here's what I've been pointing out in recent days. Human history is filled with people doing horrible things. That includes lots of people in power. And it's filled with people doing awesome, amazing things. I talked about this in my October 7th speech. I mentioned that I get asked all the time why I don't just give up, why I keep trying to push truth and facts. Honestly, the first answer here is people like you. If you're listening to this, then it's probably because you care about what's true. Experience has shown me that there are people across the country and around the world who are reachable. That's where you come in. I talk about this all the time because I have to for pragmatic reasons. I say, hey, share this show and rate and review it. It's not about helping me. It's about a movement. The most potent thing we can do is get these big media organizations to shape up their act. I hear from people all the time inside news agencies that the big bosses are aware of this show and are afraid that lots of people will discover it because then they might have to actually make changes. So the more you do to help get the word out about this, the further we get in that effort. That's it for today. I want to tell you what I'm working on for next week. This week, I focused on the what of the election, what we know and don't know. For next week, I'm working on the why. Media organizations have been basically opening up the floodgates to anyone who wants to claim that they know why this result happened. That problem runs a lot deeper than it might seem, and it has a dramatic effect, not just on this, but on news in general. I'm going to dig into that. As I prepare for it, a question for you. Of everything you're seeing in the news, what are the best and worst explanations for the result of this election that you have seen? Send me links. There are 2 ways to do it. Anyone can do this. Paid subscribers to the newsletter, you can send it to me through direct messaging or comments in the newsletter. Everyone else, there is a form that's really cool that you can use. You can find it at the link in the show notes or at my website, joshlevs.com. Send me whatever it is that you think are the best or worst examples of explanations about this election, and anything else you think I should cover on this show. You are the reason to keep going. As always, thank you so much for listening. I will see you next week.